"Get your trash out of my building," Brandon screamed, throwing the white folder containing my termination papers directly at my chest. The heavy brass clips on the folder caught the light of the top-floor office, snapping open as the pages scattered across the polished mahogany floor. He stood behind his father's old desk, chest heaving, his face flushed with the kind of unearned rage only a trust fund executive could manage. I looked at the papers, then at the Golden Parker pen still rolling near the edge of the desk, and finally at Brandon's smirk. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend my 15-year record or mention the millions in lease revenue I had brought to Thorn Real Estate. I just knelt, picked up my personal notebook, and looked Brandon dead in the eye. "Understood," I said. I packed my leather briefcase, walked out of the glass double doors of the boardroom, and took the elevator down. Within 24 hours, the legal mechanism I had quietly woven into the foundation of our premier asset would pull the rug out from under his entire family empire. To understand how a single signature could dismantle a $400 million real estate portfolio, you have to go back to 2017. I'd been working at Thorn Real Estate for 6 years by then. I was 36, holding a fresh MBA and a decade of commercial brokerage experience under my belt. The commercial market in Seattle was experiencing a brutal correction. Tech companies were downsizing. Vacancy rates in Class A office towers were climbing toward 18%, and Walter Thorn, the founder of the firm, was panicking. Walter was a self-made developer of the old school. He built Thorn Real Estate on sweat, debt, and timing. But in 2017, his crown jewel, the newly completed 40-story Obsidian Tower downtown, was sitting half-empty. The interest payments on his $85 million construction loan were eating our cash reserves alive. The bank was threatening to trigger a technical default because our debt service coverage ratio had dropped below the required 1.25 threshold. We needed long-term, high-credit tenants on the premier top floors, and we needed them fast to stabilize our valuation for refinancing. That was when I brought him the tech portfolio. I had spent months cultivating relationships with 3 of the fastest-growing technology firms in the Pacific Northwest: Sentry Cybersec, Aegis AI, and Kestrel Data. They were looking for premium space, specifically the top 3 floors of a landmark tower with dedicated fiber optic feeds and heavy security zones. But they wanted flexibility that a traditional, rigid corporate landlord like Walter couldn't provide. They wanted customized tenant improvement allowances, sub-metered power grids for their server racks, and short-term expansion options that Thorn Real Estate's standard boilerplate lease agreements simply didn't support. Walter was too conservative to bend. He refused to deal with their complex technical riders. So, I proposed a solution that solved everyone's problems. I would create an independent entity, Apex Office Group LLC. My private company would sign a 10-year master lease for floors 38, 39, and 40 of Obsidian Tower. Apex would pay Thorn Real Estate a guaranteed fixed master rent of $1.2 million annually, regardless of vacancy. In exchange, Apex would have the exclusive right to custom build, sublease, and manage those 3 floors for the tech clients. Walter jumped at the opportunity. For him, it was a guaranteed low-risk cash flow that instantly pacified the lenders. For me, it was a high-stakes play. I took out a second mortgage on my house to fund the tenant improvements, installing the specialized cooling systems and backup generators Sentry Cybersec required. I worked 80-hour weeks coordinating with structural engineers, fire marshals, and network technicians. By 2018, all 3 floors were fully occupied. Sentry Cybersec, Aegis AI, and Kestrel Data signed long-term sublease agreements with Apex Office Group LLC. Because of the specialized infrastructure and premium management I provided, the combined annual sublease revenue from the 3 tenants reached $3.6 million. After paying the $1.2 million master rent to Thorn Real Estate and operating expenses, my private LLC was netting $2.4 million annually. For 7 years, the arrangement worked flawlessly. Walter got his guaranteed monthly rent checks on the dot, which allowed him to refinance the Obsidian Tower at a favorable rate. The tech tenants had a responsive, specialized landlord who understood their infrastructure needs, and I was rewarded for my risk, building a substantial personal nest egg while maintaining my day job as the senior commercial leasing manager for Thorn Real Estate, managing the rest of the company's retail and office portfolio. But then, Walter's health began to fail. In late 2025, he suffered a stroke that forced him to step back from daily operations. Control of the company was handed to his 33-year-old son, Brandon Thorn. Brandon was a business school graduate who had never negotiated a real lease in his life. He spent his first 6 months as chief operating officer replacing senior managers with his personal friends and remodeling the executive suite with Italian marble. He looked at Thorn Real Estate not as a business built on long-term relationships, but as a cash machine to fund his grand expansion plans. It didn't take long for Brandon's eyes to land on the master lease for the top floors of the Obsidian Tower. He saw the $3.6 million in sublease revenue my tenants were paying to Apex Office Group LLC. He saw the $1.2 million Apex was paying to Thorn Real Estate. In his simplistic view of corporate finance, he believed I was stealing $2.4 million in annual profit that rightfully belonged to his family's company. He didn't see the 7 years of risk I had carried. He didn't see the capital I had invested from my own pocket or the specialized support I provided to the tenants. He only saw a pool of cash he wanted to seize to prop up the company's balance sheet before a crucial new $150 million refinancing audit with the bank. He began dropping hints during our weekly leasing meetings, questioning the legitimacy of the Apex agreement. I kept my head down, documented every conversation, and made sure all my lease filings were completely up to date. I knew the storm was coming, but I also knew the exact terms of the contracts I had signed. I had drafted the master lease in 2017 with Walter, and I had insisted on specific protective clauses to ensure that my personal investment could never be stolen by a corporate coup. As Brandon's hostility grew, I quietly reviewed those clauses, waiting for him to make his first fatal move. The tension came to a head on a rainy Thursday morning in mid-April. I was in my office reviewing the retail occupancy reports for our suburban shopping centers when my desk phone rang. It was Brandon's assistant, telling me the chief operating officer wanted to see me in the main executive boardroom on the 40th floor immediately. When I walked into the boardroom, I saw Brandon sitting at the head of the long conference table. Next to him was Gerald Foster, a 35-year-old leasing agent Brandon had hired from a rival firm 3 months prior. Gerald was the definition of a corporate climber, always nodding in agreement with Brandon's ideas and dressing in identical tailored gray suits. On the table between them lay a thick blue folder and a single sheet of paper. "Sit down, Maxwell," Brandon said, not looking up from his tablet. I took a seat opposite him. Gerald gave me a tight, insincere smile before looking back at Brandon. "We've been doing a deep audit of the company's commercial assets as part of our preparation for the new $150 million bank refinancing package." Brandon began, setting the tablet down and leaning forward. "And we've uncovered a highly disturbing arrangement regarding floors 38, 39, and 40. Is that so?" I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Yes," Brandon sneered, tapping the blue folder. "Your private company, Apex Office Group LLC, has been leasing those 3 floors for a ridiculous flat fee of $1.2 million, while collecting $3.6 million in sublease payments from Sentry Cybersec, Aegis AI, and Kestrel Data. That is a $2.4 million annual discrepancy. As an executive of Thorn Real Estate, you have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of this firm. Instead, you've been funneling company profits into your own pocket for years. It's a flagrant conflict of interest." I looked at Brandon, then at Gerald, who was looking out the window as if he had nothing to do with this. "Brandon, that agreement was negotiated and signed in 2017 with your father, Walter Thorn," I explained calmly. "At the time, the building was vacant, the debt service coverage ratio was below 1.0, and the bank was threatening foreclosure. I took the personal financial risk to fund the tenant improvements when this company didn't have the cash. The board approved the master lease agreement, and it has been fully disclosed in every annual corporate audit for the last 7 years. My father was old and desperate," Brandon said, his voice rising. He allowed a parasite to bleed his company dry. But I am running things now. We are restructuring our assets, and we cannot have a manager holding a master lease on our premier property. It looks terrible to our refinancing lenders. So, what are you proposing? I asked. Brandon slid the single sheet of paper across the polished wood toward me. It was a transfer agreement, drafted by the company's legal counsel. You will sign this agreement, Brandon said. It transfers all sublease contracts held by Apex Office Group LLC directly to Thorn Real Estate, effective immediately. You will dissolve Apex, and you will receive a standard leasing commission of 3% on the active leases, paid out over the next 3 years. In exchange, the company will waive its right to sue you for breach of fiduciary duty. I skimmed the document. The terms were laughable. They wanted me to hand over the infrastructure I had built, the clients I had spent 15 years cultivating, and a $2.4 million annual cash flow for a measly, delayed leasing commission. And if I refuse? I asked, sliding the paper back. Gerald shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. Maxwell, you have to understand the optics here. If you refuse, it looks like you are actively working against the interests of Thorn Real Estate. That is grounds for immediate termination for cause. Brandon leaned back, a smug expression on his face. If you don't sign, you are fired today. Fired for cause, which means no severance, no stock option vesting, and a black mark on your career in this city. And we will file a lawsuit against you in the state court by 5 o'clock this afternoon, frozen assets included. You'll spend the next 3 years paying lawyers to defend a contract my father signed when he wasn't in his right mind. I looked at the transfer document again. I knew Walter Thorne had been in perfect mental health in 2017, and I had the medical certificates and board minutes in my private archives to prove it. But I also knew Brandon was too arrogant to listen to facts. He believed his title and his family name gave him absolute power. He wanted a war, and he had convinced himself that I was weak because I had spent 15 years working quietly in his father's shadow. I reached into my breast pocket, pulled out my notebook, and placed it inside my briefcase. I stood up and closed the leather lid, snapping the brass locks into place. I will not sign this transfer, Brandon, I said. Brandon's face darkened instantly. He slammed his hand on the table, standing up to confront me. Then you're done. Maxwell, he yelled. You're fired. Gerald here is taking over as the lead commercial director starting today. I want your security badge on this table, and I want you out of this building in 20 minutes. Don't touch your computer. Security will pack your personal belongings and mail them to your house. You think you're smart, but you're nothing but an employee who got greedy. I stood there, feeling the quiet weight of the room. I felt no anger, only a cold, mechanical clarity. Understood, I said. I unclipped my security badge from my belt and placed it gently on the mahogany table next to the unsigned transfer document. I picked up my briefcase, looked at Gerald for a brief second, and walked out. As the elevator doors closed on the 40th floor, I took out my phone and dialed the direct number for my attorney. The game had begun, and Brandon had just walked straight into the first trap. I met my attorney, Louis Campbell, at a quiet French bistro 3 blocks away from the Obsidian Tower. Louis was a veteran of the Seattle commercial real estate scene, a man who had spent 30 years dissecting complex lease agreements and partnership contracts. He was already waiting for me at a corner booth, a cup of black coffee in front of him, and his tablet open. I slid into the booth and placed my briefcase on the bench beside me. Did they do it? Louis asked, taking a sip of his coffee. Fired for cause, I said. Supposedly for conflict of interest regarding the Apex lease. Brandon threatened to sue me by 5 o'clock if I didn't sign the transfer agreement. Louis let out a short, dry laugh. Brandon always did have more money than sense. Did he actually put the firing in writing? I opened my briefcase and pulled out the physical termination letter. Brandon's assistant had emailed to my personal address just 10 minutes after I left the building. It was signed by Brandon Thorne, Chief Operating Officer, citing immediate termination for breach of company loyalty and fiduciary duty due to the ownership of Apex Office Group LLC. Louis scanned the letter, his eyes gleaming behind his reading glasses. This is perfect, he said. He didn't even consult their general counsel. If he had, their legal team would have thrown themselves in front of his car to stop him from signing this. He tapped his tablet, opening a scanned copy of the 2017 master lease agreement I had signed with Walter Thorne. He scrolled down to Article 16, Section 2, the clause we had drafted in Walter's office 7 years ago. "Let's read the exact language," Lewis said, turning the tablet toward me. Article 16, Section 2, termination by executive firing. In the event that Maxwell Reed is terminated from his employment or executive role at Thorne Real Estate for any reason other than voluntary resignation, Apex Office Group LLC shall have the option to terminate this master lease agreement upon 24 hours written notice to the landlord. Upon such termination, the landlord shall be liable to Apex for a termination penalty equal to 12 months of the master lease rent, totaling $1.2 million, and shall reimburse Apex for all tenant relocation costs. Furthermore, all sublease agreements held by Apex with subtenants shall remain under the sole control of Apex, and the landlord shall have no claim to the sublease revenue or contractual relationships with said subtenants. It's as airtight today as it was in 2017, I said. Airtight doesn't even cover it, Lewis replied. Brandon thinks he can sue you for fiduciary breach, but the board minutes from 2017 show a full disclosure of your ownership of Apex, a unanimous vote approving the master lease, and a signed conflict waiver by Walter Thorne as CEO. There is no breach. There is only a valid contract that Brandon has just triggered. Have you heard back from the management at Zenith Tower? I asked. Lewis nodded, pulling up a second document on his screen. Zenith Tower, the brand new 50-story Class A development directly across the street, had been struggling. Since completing construction in 2024, they had been sitting at a 60% vacancy rate, desperately trying to attract high-credit tech tenants to satisfy their own lenders. They are ecstatic, Lewis said. I reviewed the letter of intent from Horizon Properties, the owners of Zenith. They are offering Apex a 10-year lease on floors 41, 42, and 43 for $1 million annually. That's $200,000 less than you were paying Thorne Real Estate. Even better, because they are desperate for occupancy, Horizon is offering a 6-month rent abatement and will pay for the entire physical relocation of your tenants, including the installation of matching server rack infrastructure and dedicated fiber lines. They've also agreed to pay Apex a 15% commercial brokerage commission for bringing the tenants over. That's a $150,000 signing bonus just for moving across the street, I remarked. Exactly, Lewis said. Now, what about the tenants themselves? Will they move? I pulled out my phone. I knew they would, but I needed to confirm the details. For the past year, Brandon had been trying to squeeze extra revenue out of Sentry Cybersec, Aegis AI, and Kestrel Data. He had tried to charge them a 20% surcharge on shared cooling systems, restricted their security personnel's access to the loading docks, and ignored their requests for routine maintenance. They were completely fed up with Thorne Real Estate's management. I called Clara Finch, the operations director at Sentry Cybersec. I explained the situation in plain terms. Clara, I've been let go from Thorne Real Estate, I said, and I am exercising the relocation clause in our sublease agreement. Apex is moving its operations to the brand new Zenith Tower across the street. We've secured 3 custom floors, and the landlord there is paying for your entire relocation. Your rent remains identical, but you get newer facilities and a dedicated cooling grid. Is Brandon Thorne still going to be our landlord if we stay? Clara asked, her voice tight. If you stay, you will have to negotiate a new lease with Brandon, I said, and he has already indicated he wants to raise your rent by 30% to match what he claims is market rate. We're in, Clara said immediately. We've been looking for an excuse to get away from that kid. When do we sign? I made 2 more calls. Roger Miller from Aegis AI and Silas Cross from Kestrel Data gave me the exact same response. They trusted me because I had spent 7 years ensuring their servers never went offline. They had no interest in dealing with Brandon's amateur management. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting in Lewis's office. We drafted 2 formal notices. The first was a 24-hour notice of termination of the master lease, addressed to Brandon Thorne and Thorne Real Estate, citing Article 16, Section 2. The second was a formal notice of relocation to my 3 subtenants, accompanied by the new lease agreements for Zenith Tower, I signed both documents on behalf of Apex Office Group LLC. Tomorrow morning, Brandon would walk into his office expecting a victory. Instead, he would find a legal and financial void that would bring his father's company to its knees. At exactly 9 o'clock on Friday morning, a certified process server walked into the lobby of Thorn Real Estate and delivered the 24-hour termination notice to Brandon's assistant. At the same time, digital copies were sent to the company's general counsel and the senior underwriters at Pacific Merchant Bank, the institution handling the $150 million refinancing package. According to my lawyer Lewis, who was monitoring the emails, the initial reaction from the executive suite was silence. Brandon apparently assumed the notice was a bluff, a desperate legal threat from a disgruntled employee. Around 10:30, Brandon and his new lead commercial director, Gerald Foster, took the elevator up to the 38th floor to assess the situation. They expected to find the tech employees working at their desks, and they planned to offer them direct leases with Thorn Real Estate, cutting Apex out of the loop. Instead, they walked into complete chaos. The elevator doors opened to reveal dozens of moving crates stacked in the reception area. Tech technicians in blue uniforms were carefully unmounting server racks and packing fiber optic switches into anti-static containers. Clara Finch was standing in the middle of the lobby, clipboard in hand, directing a team of professional commercial movers. Brandon pushed past a mover carrying a box of server cables and marched up to Clara. "What is the meaning of this?" Brandon demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Why are you packing?" "We are moving, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, not looking up from her clipboard. "Our lease here has been terminated." "You can't move," Brandon said, his face turning red. "Your lease is for this building. If Apex terminated their lease, that means you have to sign directly with us. We've already drafted the paperwork. You can stay in this space and we'll handle everything." Clara stopped writing and looked Brandon in the eye. "No, Mr. Thorne. Our contract is with Apex Office Group LLC, not Thorn Real Estate. Our agreement contains a specific clause that gives us the right to relocate to any property managed by Apex if the master lease is terminated due to landlord actions. We signed our new leases yesterday. The movers are taking us across the street to Zenith Tower. But we can sue you for breaking the lease," Brandon yelled, his composure slipping. "Sue us?" Clara laughed. "On what grounds? We don't have a contract with you. Our legal department reviewed this last night. If you try to block our equipment from leaving this building, we'll file an injunction for tortious interference before noon." Brandon spun around and looked at Gerald, who was frantically scrolling through his phone. "Gerald, tell me she's wrong," Brandon snapped. Gerald looked up, his face pale. "Brandon, the master lease agreement, it's real. Apex had the right to terminate, and the sublease contracts are entirely controlled by Apex. We don't have any direct legal relationship with these tenants." Brandon stormed up to the 39th and 40th floors, only to find the same scene. At Aegis AI and Kestrel Data, moving crews were systematically dismantling the offices. By Monday morning, 3 of the premier floors of the Obsidian Tower, representing 36% of the building's total commercial square footage, would be completely dark. By noon, the panic had set in. The underwriters at Pacific Merchant Bank had received the termination notice and immediately called a crisis meeting. The $150 million and $50 refinancing deal was based on a property valuation of $400 million. That valuation assumed a 92% occupancy rate, anchored by Sentry CyberSec, Aegis AI, and Kestrel Data. With those 3 floors vacant, the building's occupancy would plummet to 56%. The debt service coverage ratio would drop to 0.8, far below the bank's minimum requirement of 1.25. The refinancing deal was effectively dead. Even worse, the existing $85 million construction loan was set to mature on the following Friday. If the refinancing package didn't close by Monday afternoon, Thorn Real Estate would default on the loan. The lenders would have the right to foreclose on the Obsidian Tower, wiping out the Thorn family's equity. My phone began ringing at 12:30. I sat in Lewis's office watching the screen light up. The caller ID showed Brandon's name, then Gerald's, then the main office line. I let them ring. By 3 o'clock, I had 52 missed calls and 38 emails. Finally, at 3:15, a call came in from Walter Thorne's personal number. I answered it. "Maxwell, it's Walter," a frail voice said. I felt a pang of sadness. Walter was a good man who had worked hard, but he had let his son run the business into the ground. "Hello, Walter," I said. "I'm sitting here with Brandon," Walter said, coughing slightly. "He told me what happened. He made a terrible mistake, Maxwell. He's young and he was foolish. But we cannot let the bank take the tower. Please, we need to resolve this." I looked at Lewis, who nodded slowly. "Walter, I have no desire to destroy the company you built," I said. "But Brandon fired me for cause, accused me of fraud, and threatened to sue me. I cannot work under those conditions." "Brandon is listening," Walter said. "He will apologize. We will hire you back. We will pay you whatever you want." I cleared my throat. "It's too late for a simple hire back, Walter. The leases at Zenith Tower are already signed. The only way Apex returns to the Obsidian Tower is if we sign a new agreement on my terms." "Let me hear them," Walter said. I slid the paper we had drafted to the center of the desk. I read the terms clearly into the phone. First, Thorne Real Estate will pay Apex the $1.2 million termination penalty as required by Article 16, Section 2 within 48 hours. Second, Thorne Real Estate will cover the $450,000 in moving and setup costs incurred by Apex and the tenants. Third, if Apex returns, the new master lease rent will be reduced to $600,000 annually for the next 10 years, and Apex will retain 100% of the sublease revenue. Fourth, Brandon Thorne will resign as Chief Operating Officer immediately, and management of the company's portfolio will be handed over to a professional, independent third-party firm. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, I heard Brandon's voice screaming in the background, calling me a thief. I waited. I knew the clock was ticking, and Monday morning was only 2 days away. Brandon's screaming did not last long. Over the weekend, the cold reality of the financial market set in. The senior underwriters at Pacific Merchant Bank made it clear to Walter Thorne that without the signed leases for floors 38, 39, and 40, the $150 million refinancing package was dead. On Monday morning, the bank would issue a notice of default on the $85 million construction loan, and foreclosure proceedings on the Obsidian Tower would begin. Walter Thorne had built his entire life around that tower. He could not watch it be sold at a public auction to satisfy a debt his son's arrogance had caused. On Sunday afternoon, at a private meeting, in the conference room of Lewis Campbell's law firm, Walter signed the agreement. Brandon was not present. He had been stripped of his authority and sent to a family-owned warehouse property in rural eastern Washington, far away from any commercial lease negotiations. His corporate credit cards were canceled, his company car was repossessed, and he was placed on a strict restricted allowance from the family trust. Gerald Foster, the yes-man Brandon had hired, was terminated by the board of directors that same evening. On Monday morning, the bank's auditors arrived at the Obsidian Tower to conduct their final review. The paperwork they were handed was flawless. Thorne Real Estate had wire transferred the $1.2 million termination penalty to Apex Office Group LLC's account. They had also paid the $450,000 in relocation and cancellation costs. This included a $250,000 cancellation fee to Horizon Properties, the owners of Zenith Tower, to release Apex and the tech tenants from the leases we had signed the previous Friday. The tech tenants never actually had to move their physical servers. The movers were halted mid-process, and the infrastructure remained completely intact. The new 10-year master lease between Thorne Real Estate and Apex Office Group LLC was officially executed. Under the new terms, my private company leased the top 3 floors of the Obsidian Tower for a flat fee of $600,000 annually, down from the original $1.2 million. The sublease agreements with Sentry Cybersec, Aegis AI, and Kestrel Data remained in place, bringing in $3.6 million in annual revenue. With my lease cost cut in half, Apex's annual net profit increased from $2.4 million to $3 million. Over the 10-year life of the contract, this adjustment represented an additional $6 million in pure profit for my private company, all funded by Thorn Real Estate's desperate need to secure the bank refinancing. On Tuesday morning, the new professional management firm hired to run Thorn Real Estate took over the executive suite. I walked into the Obsidian Tower, not as an employee, but as the building's most valuable tenant. I took the elevator up to the 38th floor, where the tech technicians were busy setting up a new security portal for Sentry CyberSec. Clara Finch was standing by the window, holding a cup of coffee and looking out at the city skyline. She turned and smiled when she saw me. "Everything back to normal?" she asked. "Better than normal, Clara," I said. "We have a new management team downstairs and your utility rates are locked in for the next 10 years. "Good," she said, clinking her mug against mine. "It's nice to have a landlord who actually knows how to run a building." I walked up to the 40th floor and stood in the empty boardroom where Brandon had stood screaming at me just a few days ago. The mahogany table was clean, the blue folders were gone, and the rain was tapping softly against the glass. I thought about Brandon, sitting in a cold warehouse office in eastern Washington, realizing too late that power in the corporate world doesn't come from a family name or a title on a business card. It comes from the contracts you sign and the relationships you build. I had spent 15 years working quietly, learning the rules of the game and placing my pieces on the board. When the time came, I didn't need to shout or make a scene. I just pulled the switch and let the mechanics of the law do the rest.